Joanna Macy, the great environmental activist and systems ecologist, said that when faced with planetary crisis, there are three stories we can tell ourselves. Business as usual, in which we tell ourselves that some degree of damage is necessary for human progress. The great unraveling, in which we tell ourselves that mass ecosystem destruction is inevitable. And the great turning, in which we tell ourselves that evolving the way we live is the only way forward, and that we're at the beginning of one of the great projects in human history. On this podcast, we talk to people who are writing that third story, with their own work and their own lives. Mission-driven leaders who are dedicated to social and environmental impact at this critical moment for our species. Welcome to The Turning Point. If you care at all about the food system and human health, you need to know today's guest, David Leon. David is one of the co-founders of Farmers Footprint, one of the earliest and biggest voices in the regenerative agriculture movement. These days, as a principal with Esso Partners, he's leveraging his expertise in finance to take on one of the fundamental challenges in regenerative agriculture: how to align financial investment with whole supply chains that support healthy soil and regenerative food production. In a lot of ways, this discussion is a companion to our previous episode with Nick Rinke from Habitaire, in that it lays out two fundamental truths we all have to grapple with. First is the somewhat unpleasant truth that this complex, fragile, and financialized economy we've inherited is the reality we have to work within if we're going to change the food system. Second, however, is an undeniably good truth that regenerative practices are more profitable and sustainable than extractive ones. As David Leon helps us see, profit motive isn't the problem. It's what outcomes those profits are aligned to. And the challenge is to realign the economic value of money to the sustainable, multifaceted value produced by successful stewardship of soil and land, and whole supply chains that reinforce that value all the way to the dinner table. It's a truth our ancestors lived by for thousands of years, that when we value and care for the land produces nearly immeasurable value in return. Our ancestors, in reality, were brilliant economists, and their brilliance was in understanding how to invest shrewdly in holistic, integrated, long-term ecologies that would sustain their people for generations. In another context, it might just be called wisdom. Whatever we decide to call it, David Leon has a lot of it. Hope you enjoy this conversation. David Leon, welcome to The Turning Point.
Good to be here.
Yeah, appreciate you taking the time. Appreciate you taking the time and also sifting through our technical difficulties. But we're here to facilitate a very different conversation around agriculture and connection to the earth. So let's just dive right in. Can you share a little bit about your perspective around agriculture and food systems at a high level, but in particular, how agriculture represents this kind of crucial connection to the earth itself?
Yeah, I think the attraction to food and agriculture systems is sort of inherent in the connection that we all have to our food systems, which is these are things that come out of the earth and we put into our body. And that's a universal reality for everyone. We all have to have this relationship, and that happens at varying degrees. But to me, I think that's one of the most exciting things about this. And agriculture is this sort of proxy and system that we've used to figure out how to feed large populations at scale and do all sorts of other things, manage for, pests and disease and whatever happens to come across. But at core, we are feeding ourselves. And whether you look at it through a technology lens, a political lens, a scientific lens, that is what we all are working for here. And there's something that we can all agree is just very fundamental about who we are and how we interact with the planet.
As we were doing research for this podcast, we were listening to some previous interviews that you were in, and you had this really interesting anecdote about a cantaloupe. Mm-hmm. And so if we can kind of double click on this relationship, food being this interface as a relationship with the earth, but could you share a little bit about, different origin stories and how to think about food maybe when one's like traveling through the grocery store?
Mm. Yeah, so that's sort of an analogy about food systems and what it takes to get any piece of produce, we'll call it, from the field to a consumer's plate. And I think one of the things that you realize early on as you start to delve into these systems, if your only interaction with your food system has been sort of at a grocery store, you've seen produce sitting on a shelf. And that as a technology sort of articulation hasn't changed for thousands of years, right? Like you could go to the medieval times if you want and probably see fruit on a cart. But the pathway that it takes to get there has obviously changed and evolved massively. And as we've gotten into different ways that we've chosen to sort of express our food system, we've chosen to lay certifications over the top of it. We've chosen to lay sort of market dynamics over the top of these things. You realize that, those pathways and the story behind that, any given cantaloupe, may vary widely from just cantaloupe X dollars per pound sitting on the cart. So you might have behind that a producer who has invested heavily in, environmental remediation and conservation and protection, and they may not be spraying pesticides, or they may. So those sorts of details of production are lost ultimately at the point of sale. And that has been sort of a central theme in the way that we think about how do we make this food system better. And we've tried to sort of, lay these proxy certifications on to say, hey, we're going to help track the identity of that cantaloupe, or we're going to help reward the farmer for doing things that we want them incentivized to do. But if that story is ultimately not getting across to the consumer when they're buying that, or they don't understand what is really the difference between an organic cantaloupe or a regenerative organic cantaloupe and just a regular old cantaloupe, what is that, aside from price, which I can tell the difference of right away because that's on the label. But if I don't really understand the rest of the context behind that, what have we actually done? How have we deepened the participation between a person and their food system? And so that's why I bring that up, is it layers in sort of the complexity that you have to deal with when you're working in these systems. And it's brought up right against this sort of very obvious and simplistic interaction, which is people walking up to fruit on a cart and picking it up. But there's a lot that happens in between, and there's either a lot of context missing or a lot of context that can still be filled in.
Yeah, it's true. The richness of the story is one that you won't, if you're not privy to it, you won't understand the depth of it. But if we could kind of zero in and double click on something that you mentioned, right? You said sometimes when that person is shopping for the cantaloupe in the market, all they see is a difference in price, right? And so if the cantaloupe or if food is this kind of gateway to a relationship with the earth, then maybe we could think about the economics of it and the price of the cantaloupe as a gateway to our relationship with different growing practices.
Mm-hmm.
So could you talk a little bit about the economics of the current agriculture system, and particularly maybe some of the economic challenges of transitioning to more environmentally friendly growing practices?
Yeah, I think you have to start with a story about aims and design. What have we designed our food system to do? And since the start of the sort of agricultural revolution and large scale farming that sort of came out of post-World War technological developments in terms of, chemical fertilizer and this green revolution that we've talked about. What you are realizing is it was designed to deliver calories as cheaply and efficiently as possible. Now, calories is distinct from nutrition, consequences in your land management practices on the surrounding environment, consequences for human populations that sit alongside those productions. And the system, by and large, has done a really good job at attaining that goal. We can deliver calories very cheaply and quite efficiently at this point. Now, what we haven't accounted for when we think about just that one dimension of capital, which is financial capital, which we've really optimized for there, we have all these externalities. We have the proliferation of pesticide exposure as a way of managing these fields. We have degradation of nutrient density because we're not taking care of our soil. We're not actually taking care of the microbiology in the soil, treating it as living. We've been really good, again, with the aim of delivering calories cheaply. We've designed a lot of our technologies to produce a green plant that yields and is shippable. In a lot of cases, we've designed tomatoes with really thick skin so that they can ship. We've designed things that we can pick early. And so when it shows up, 1,000 miles later somewhere, it, looks like a fruit that we recognize. We've designed apples that can survive and stay crisp, 11 months in cold storage. Um, so that design starts to become a really important facet. What do we want our food system to actually deliver, if not calories as cheaply as possible? If that is a part of what we want in the future of our food system, what else is actually important to us? And that's the conversation that I'm often sort of engaged in the way that I interact with our stakeholders across that system, and even trying to discern, where do consumers want this to go? What sort of relationship do we want to have with our food system? Do we want something that tastes really good? Do we want it to be really healthy? Do we want it to not damage the environment and the people who are actually cultivating these products? Because I think if we actually very intentionally design for those things, I think we have a pretty good shot at attaining them. But right now, for a long time, I should say, we weren't really designing with those things in mind, and so we got the food system that we sort of designed for. And so, the trope now is like, is our food system broken? No, it's doing what it was designed to do, but we need to sort of reframe that definition of like, this is what's actually important to us now. Maybe we should think about different ways to do this.
Right. It's a really sophisticated understanding, and if we could continue to kind of tease this thread around the
Mm-hmm.
economics of it, maybe if you could give us, like a kindergarten level walkthrough of capital in the space of agriculture, and then dive one layer deeper and talk about some of the challenges you've experienced in terms of aligning investors and outside capital with more regenerative growing practices.
Mm-hmm. So I think the thing to think about there, some of your listeners may be familiar with these sort of multiple levels or forms of capital, right? Financial capital being just one facet of what we think about as capital. Other ones, social capital and natural capital. So like ecological capital and built capital. And so there's been different ways that these things are named, but the idea here is that you have multiple forms of capital, and these things need to be brought into sort of right relationship with one another. And I think we've got a system heavily mechanized and optimized to be oriented around return of financial capital, right? And agriculture in some ways was like a gateway drug to these things, because when you deal with biological systems and when you think about cultivating soil, these practices are actually these like articulations of investment and return. What are you putting your energy into? What are you cultivating that's already there? What sorts of relationships are sort of driving the outcomes you want? There's really collaborative, incredible relationships that are happening between the microbiology and the soil and the root of the plant. And it turns out, like when you are cultivating the capacity for those interactions to happen, that's when you get really magical outcomes. That's when you get actually quite a lot of abundance. That's when you get these positive consequences instead of just negative ones. You start to get interesting phenols and flavors and nutrient potential. And you actually increase the capacity of the soil to grow more plants with less inputs. But when you're only optimizing for the financial, I think your aperture is condensed, and you start thinking about, well, I just want a plant that looks good, that yields a lot, and that I can move around. And you don't have those negative externalities on your balance sheet. I think, a lot of the work that I end up doing is, it's sort of twofold. On the one hand, we start to develop vocabulary for people. This is like a language issue. We need to sort of put these in some ways mysterious and opaque biological processes into a story that is understandable by a world that is sort of steeped in this financial capital centric way of working. So let me get into an example. Like when I'm trying to work with an investor who wants to invest in a regenerative farm, for instance, what are the things that we need to put in front of that investor to both be a good fiduciary for their investors? Investors have investors, funds have investors, and they need to be a steward of that capital. So financial return is important, but there's sort of an API that needs to happen. We need to start to give them a sense of, okay, there's a financial return possible here, but it may not come in the same way that you've always thought about it coming in. That if we actually make investments into the land in doing something that is slightly less scalable or slightly less efficient, what we are doing is investing into the underlying land asset. And because of that, we have better flood and drought tolerance. We have better resistance to disease and things that increase the risk. And so you have to now put these biological processes into terms of risk and reward and return. And that takes a whole bunch of translation. It takes actually building quite a lot of empathy on both sides of that table. You need to really understand the needs of the farmers. And the farmers are not, they are also steeped in this culture of, I'm running a business, I need to produce as much as possible. I'm thinking about a season to season bet that I need to make. What are commodity markets going to do? So there's a journey for the farmer to go on there. That's why there's a huge group of people that are working on how do we transition farmers and change their mindset. And then there's people on the other hand, and I tend to move towards the capital side of this because I think that's where I'm being called to contribute. But yeah, we got to take those investors, we got to take those foundations, all of these different sorts of streams of capital, we got to take them on a learning journey too. So it's not just bringing the consumer closer to the farm. We talk a lot about that. There's a lot of people working on that. We take investors out onto the farm. We try to help them understand some of the underlying, drivers that are going to contribute to return beyond just financial capital. And we think that some of those returns are actually consequences of having a different mindset and bringing that mindset into your investment thesis, and then innovating on those structures. Just like the farms are set up to have clean rows and be super sprayable so that we can make sure that we can put the pesticide on as efficiently as possible. We have financial vehicles that are set up for conventional ways of working as well. And those may not be in the best service to the types of opportunities that we want to bring now. Opportunities that move beyond quarterly profits and NKs and everything else that we were sort of driven on these short cycles. We have to now take investors on a journey that says, what does this look like 7 years from now? Because we're talking about landscape level transitions. These are slower. Let's get them out of an annual mindset and in a perennial mindset now. So you can see I'm trying to throw a bunch of different examples of the mindset shift that I'm really looking for here. And there's many tools out there and there's a lot of room for innovation around those tools. But I think the first step and what we're still really at is paradigm shift within the minds of farmers. We say one of the biggest blockers to regenerative transition is between the ears of the farmer. And that's putting a lot of onus just on the farmer. And it's not just for that farmer to have to figure out, but that is a useful analogy. Is like most of the farmers now were brought up within the context of industrialized farming. And this is how you do it. They were taught at the top ag schools, this is how you do it. And what we see in the breakout sort of regenerative farmer heroes that we've seen, the Gabe Browns and the Adam Chappells and, some of these folks that are in the documentary circuits and that kind of thing, they were pushed to those levels by existential threat to their farm. where the biology on the farm was collapsing, and the cost of applying more and more inputs to create the same level of yield just hit, there's a tipping point where it just cannot be sustained anymore. And that was the sort of collapse that led them to say, I need to try something different. So unfortunately, maybe this is a human nature thing. We think about how do we intervene before hitting rock bottom? And what can we incentivize for them to start making themselves better? And that happens on both ends of the table and actually across the entire value chain. I don't want to just boil this down to investors and farmers on opposite ends of the table. There's 100 other steps in between, and all of them, there's an opportunity for an intervention.
Right. Yeah. So if we can try and recap, right? Is the food system broken? Not necessarily. It's doing what it's been designed to do, and that has resulted in largely commodification of food and the industrial agriculture system. But you just did a great job kind of laying out different viewpoints or perspectives around the different stakeholders within the food system,
Mhm.
right? There's capital, there's the producers and the farmers themselves, there's, of course, us as consumers, there's food processors, there's food transporters, there's
Mhm.
all of the producers of the chemicals and the machinery that goes, there's all these different stakeholders. But you used an interesting word in there earlier on when you were talking about the work that you're doing with investors, which was story. And so I'm curious, is there a central meeting point or location where maybe all of these stakeholders could come together at the same table, no pun intended, so that we can have a more nuanced conversation around making some of these systemic changes? What are some successes you've witnessed in your time in this
Hmm.
space?
I mean, I think it is happening. It's happening. It's happening all over the place. It's happening in kitchen table conversations between investors and farmers. It's happening in interfamily discussions as farmers are working on their succession strategies. This is a huge emerging topic. There's going to be a multi-trillion dollar transfer of wealth in the coming years, not just on farms, but in farms it's accentuated there because you've got large land holdings that are largely family owned, and big questions of whether the kids want to take on the farm. And so you have those conversations happening there, very nuanced conversations about given the next generation, what do they care about? Are they thinking about different ways of managing the farm than it's always been? You've got climate change pushing that conversation because there might be different crops that we need to now grow in areas that historically had never been able to support those. And then you've got lots of forms of capital out there now, philanthropic and impact and venture and private equity. You have all of these asset classes that have been really tailored again to, like, how do we break down a complex problem and categorize it into these neat little buckets, and we say now we're going to create an allocation strategy that depending on your risk profile, we're going to put them into these different buckets. And one of the challenges with that when we're dealing with the complexity of food systems is these are a bunch of different stacked types of assets, asset classes. You might have venture capital ag tech. You might have private equity processing facilities and infrastructure. You have real assets in terms of the farmland itself. And you have consumer brands that's often sort of venture related. And so one of the fundamental questions that I think we've started to tackle is, what are the capital stacks that support investing into a food system, not just into the farm? Because if you don't have the rest of it figured out, like, meaning if you build the just perfect or regenerative utopian farm and you're producing this perfect cantaloupe that is preserving the wetlands around you and is supporting bird and insect species and doesn't you're not spraying anything, and it's delicious and it's nutrient dense, it's so good, and you've invested so much time and money into producing this cantaloupe. But if it goes into the processing facility that mixes it with all your neighbors' cantaloupes, where they're doing whatever they want in the way that they produce it, what have we done? We've hit sort of a wall because everything in this system, like everything in the universe, is hitched to everything else. And so what are the ways that we can invest in wholeness around these systems? This is a really challenging question because all of our investment paradigms are sort of based on cutting these things up to really understand them at a categorical level. I've sometimes referred to it as it's a shift really from taxonomy to ecology, right? Especially in Western culture and language, we love to like name this thing and name this thing. And we're like, these are the two things. This is a species and this is a species. We're really bad at naming this part, that like that blank space between those things, because it's not blank. They're like connected to, they have 1,000 other connections to all the other species within that same ecology. And that move from sort of taxonomy to ecology, and we have obviously ecology is a field of study. It's an entire, it's widely accepted. But we haven't done it. We haven't yet really figured out how to proxy a lot of those ideas into some of our other systems. And investment is definitely one of those places. It's really hard to tell an investor, yeah, we want to invest in land, but we want that to we want to have some sort of mandate that also allows us to invest further up the value chain from that land beyond the farm gate. And it's hard to categorize, well, what's the risk profile of that? I don't understand. And I think what we're trying to figure out now is like, well, actually investing in ecologies is what's de-risking these investments. It's actually much riskier to invest into these siloed efforts. It's really risky to invest into that perfect regenerative farm, even if you achieve it, because you're not gonna get the outcomes further up the value chain that you really after. So, there's people investing in agroecology systems. There's people thinking about the missing middle of the supply chain and thinking, how do we sort of evolve processing infrastructure to meet this sort of these regenerative paradigms. So this stuff is happening. People are taking swings at it, and people are innovating and developing sorts of new vehicles for this to better match what we value in the food system. And it's not straight ahead venture capital anymore. We're thinking about the average farm. There was a capital scan study that was done in Hawaii, where I'm based, a couple years ago. And it started to map out all of the different forms of capital that go into growing an agricultural enterprise. And it's just wild, It might start out with a philanthropic grant from a well-meaning sort of impact family office. And then you might layer on debt from the USDA. And then, you might have a product that actually you can go and raise a little venture capital from. And it's just like these stacks of capital, they've been left to the entrepreneur, and in many cases that's the farmer, to just go figure it out. And so my call out is we need more expertise in the room alongside each of these stakeholders. There's some people in food systems. When I first started, I got to travel around and meet all these farmers and processors and retailers and all folks that were experts and really understood their particular piece of the food system. But we know that it just touches a lot more than that. I'm not a farmer, and here I am trying to contribute with whatever I have into this space. And I think we just need more of that expertise. We need creatives, we need storytellers, we need technologists, we need investors. And we need them not just coming in to sort of extract where they think there's value there, but actually to contribute, to add to that bed of soil, and to say like, hey, like, we're going to help you figure this stuff out, because just it's so big and complex for one mind you just can't get your head around it as a single individual. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Yeah, no, you did. And it begs me to this question of, well, to preface, one of the things that I hear you saying is that diversity of thought and diversity of skill set is needed to create a more resilient food system, right? And I think there's such a beautiful parallel and analogy there, which is, perhaps obvious after the first 30 minutes of this conversation, which is that, diversity also creates resilience in nature, right? which is one of the challenges around industrial ag and monoculture farming.
Mhm.
But setting that aside, like if diversity is what's going to create resilience and we're driving towards this more holistic, integrated food system, where do you see ag going in the next few decades? Is there like a unified theory, right? Like a unified field theory? Is that even possible? And what do you think are some of the critical next steps we're going to need to take in order to, continue to move in a healthier direction?
There are certainly theories. I don't think that there should be any sort of unified theory other than likely a move to decentralize for ag to be more local. I've been given an invitation. I moved to a small rural island community, and the vulnerabilities of large, vast supply chains and industrialized systems is really evident when you come here because we're fed by a barge that brings in all the supplies once a week. You can't just drive to the next town over, to get something that you may not have here. And so there's something about, this very physical type of isolation that is very clarifying around the power of local sourced production and self-sufficiency and the resilience that results from that. What it also made me realize, because I'm out into the larger world working with larger systems, is that every city, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, these big cities that we think of as so connected where everything is, they are also islands. We got these glimpses of that vulnerability during the pandemic where shelves were empty in those places. And a lot of those places only have a couple days of real food security should those supply lines be disrupted. And that was a wake-up call for a lot of folks, right? That you should think, if I'm sitting in Manhattan, the world is at my fingertips. I can get anything I want at any time. But that just is not the case. And so I've been inspired by the place that I live because I think it's a metaphor that we all sort of really need to deeply start to understand, that all these systems we've created are vulnerable by virtue of being so far away and disconnected from one another. And so I think that's one of the invitations, is that my unifying theory is that we are going to get better quality food. We're going to get better outcomes. We're going to drive empathy and agency up as people invest in their local food economies. And we're going to get more collaboration as we start to understand that, in my region, should there be just ubiquitous cheap apples in Hawaii? There are some apples that can be grown here, but by and large, like, no, I shouldn't actually expect to have apples at any time of year, anytime I want, for as cheap as I can get them right now. I think that's a luxury I'm okay doing without, once you understand sort of the costs behind it. And so we have convenience and efficiency that's sort of pushing these systems along. I want anything at any time at the best possible price. But on the other hand, we sort of have what folks in a lot of tropical places is like the joy of mango season. Like when mangoes come around and are ripe, it is just like it's a revelation. And people talk about it like it's mango season, you guys, because we don't get them all the time, right? And so there's a sacredness, there's a preciousness, there's a luxury or a premium, and so in that we kind of can see a pathway. We could say, wow, we have an opportunity to articulate to people what food is really worth. And we also are sort of staring down this realization that resources are not infinite, that the way in which we choose to extract or take advantage of those resources has consequences on the larger pool. But the promise is that it sort of can be infinite because it is regenerative. So if we have the right relationship with our environment, if we are reinvesting some of that profit meaningfully back into the ground, we continue to get more abundance out of that system. And then I take that and I can go to an investor and I can say, look, this is more profitable. And so we in the impact space should not be afraid of the word profit. That just happens to be, it's a dirty word in non-profit circles. Lynn Twist, a friend of mine who's from the, it was a prolific fundraiser, Hunger Project, and she insists that you do not call it nonprofit. She's like, it's for social profit. There's a different type of return there, and that's the mindset shift. Yeah, we're not distributing profit to the shareholders. Where does the profit get reinvested? Where does the abundance of a thoughtful system that we've designed, where does it go back into the soil, and what comes out? And what do we compost on the way out, by the way, too? The death cycle is really important in that also. What are we composting, and what is the richness that comes out of that composting? So when we talk about systems change into this, I am not a proponent of burning it all down. That's not the kind of activism that I ascribe to. When we go into these, maybe they're giant agrochemical corporations or something, they are often villainized in all of this. And I don't want to let them off the hook. There's some bad stuff going on. But what is in there that we can compost and then turn into something better? Because one, there's a lot of, well-meaning people in there that have to live on the same planet with the rest of us. Like, they don't want to see their environment poisoned, or they don't want to feed their kids bad food either. So what is the invitation? What is the agency we can invoke within those folks who make up these corporations? What existing infrastructure is there? The know-how, the technology, the financial resources, if we can show them another way, what can be composted and then turned into that black gold that feeds our plants for the next season. So there's just it's not all doom and gloom. Like, there's so much interesting opportunity there, and it does take a willingness to change your perspective on both sides. I entered this space through the nonprofit side, the social profit side. And I just saw a lot of vitriol and, they're not going far enough. And, it's not perfect, so we shouldn't. And if anything, my understanding of regeneration is it's not binary. It's not do this, get this out. It's a relationship, and it's a process. And so we have to have patience, and we have to have empathy for the next step that we need to take, which may be too small to be satisfying. And then the next step after that, and the next step after that. And that's how we do this. It's how we do it at the highest levels of the investment world. It's how we do it at the farmer level too. I believe that.
David, I appreciate you being sincere and authentic with your mindset. Right. And I think one of the things that's really standing out to me, and I appreciate you providing an opportunity to reconnect with this perspective, is you reminded me of a story. I was on the way back from the Dakotas with an indigenous elder. We were talking about relationship with the earth. And one of the things that he said was, the problem with you white people is that you define Mother Earth as a resource to be used, and you forget that you're in relationship with it. And as I'm hearing you talk about all the different stakeholders and all the different dynamics within the relationships that create this food space, I'm hearing you call out, as long as we approach this in a transactional way, we're going to get transactional results. But if we can change our mindset and move into a holistic relationship or a more integrative relationship with the earth, then that's really where we're going to get the outcomes that everybody's looking for. And it's one of the reasons that I always love having conversations with you, because it's a mindset shift that requires, at first, this is going to be super cliche, but the seed has to be planted in order for it to germinate. And if we can come full circle back to the consumer at the grocery store who's deciding between two cantaloupes that are different prices, there has to be the seed of awareness to understand why they might make a decision between one or the other. And so thank you for taking the time today to come and, shine light on different aspects of the food system that are not self-evident when someone walks through the grocery store or the farmer's market or the food shelf or the co-op. There's an opportunity to, like you said right at the beginning, redefine our relationship with the land through food. And so it's been a beautiful conversation as always, and thanks for sharing your insights. And that being said, there are two questions that we always like to wrap these episodes with.
Mm.
And so the first one is, what could be the highest leverage system level change that would help move this movement forward towards a more regenerative agriculture?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if this will be satisfying, but storytelling comes to mind as one of these sorts of levers because it's not a mechanical lever. It's a highly subjective and adaptable one. It's very flexible. And maybe to drill down, maybe it's the power of a metaphor. And these metaphors, they don't need to be, they could be your own metaphor. I think what you were just sharing was like, people ask me like, well, what's the way that you can start to get involved in this, right? And it's just like, well, and the canned answer is like, well, develop a relationship with a farmer near you. Go to the farmer's market and ask them about how they're producing their food. One, don't do that. Farmer doesn't want to explain to you all the ways that they're actually producing. Like that's a conversation that they're going to smile and don't do that. Support your local farmers, yes, but like please don't grill them on whether they're following regenerative organic standards. Um, but here's another option that maybe is even a wider pathway. Don't worry about food. If soil science or if all that starts to feel daunting, there's an invitation to actually be in relationship with the planet in a lot of different ways. And that's an inquiry about how am I within all of these natural cycles that are happening around me? Go outside every night and watch the moon for a couple minutes and understand that 30-day cycle. I'm a surfer, and so I think when you get in to these interactions with outside world and it's something you enjoy doing, like every surfer is watching, they're aware of the flow of the tides and currents and storm systems that are moving across the ocean and wind. These are all invitations to be in deeper relationship with the natural cycles around you. And you can do it while you're doing something you absolutely love and enjoy. And windsurfers have a higher resolution with the wind element of that. And I have a higher resolution with the swell element. And like, so whatever it is, there's an invitation to spend time on country, sit in a place that nourishes you and start to notice things. And maybe out of that comes like the building blocks of a deeper inquiry. And if you want to go into your food or you want to go into your personal health or whatever it is, these are invitations to where you can start to notice and ask a deeper question. And you don't have to go running and skipping right to like, hey, farmer, are you growing this organically? So that's maybe my small step that I would invite people to take. And I think out of that spins out, massive transformational shift. I really do believe that. And we always said, the nonprofit that I founded was in media advocacy work. And that's a tough sell in a lot of impact philanthropic sort of circles because sometimes it feels a little soft. Like, what is the impact? And what I came away understanding was what happens when a story or a metaphor, hey, soil health equals human health, this metaphor, that was what happens when a person hearing that changes their entire arc of their life to devote it to making that little piece better or to understanding that more deeply. And now you have a human being, and depending on their age, you might have decades of work that human can go and engage in that changes the arc. And that's really hard to measure and put into an impact report or a white paper, but it is undoubtedly true. It is undoubtedly true.
If you could ask listeners if there's one central message or theme any seed that you could plant for the listeners to make sure that they took away and help germinate in their own soils of self, what would that message be today?
Yeah, get curious. Get curious about the world around you. I'm a dad of two young sons, and something about the act of regenerating yourself brings this into very, very sharp clarity in some ways, right? It's a little theoretical sometimes until, well, for me, fatherhood was an eye opener in that. And when I thought about what values I would most want to instill in my children, it's curiosity, because out of curiosity everything else can flow, and it's non-prescriptive about what it should be. I don't purport to know what your listeners care about, but if you're curious enough, if you can cultivate that curiosity, it will take you where you need to go. So that is my recommendation. Get and stay curious, please.
David, thank you so much for your time today and sharing of yourself and the messages and the insights and the wisdom. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and hopefully there's been a lot of threads that listeners could get curious about. So really appreciate your time and your authenticity and the work that you do. And looking forward to having more conversations in the future as to the way that you're helping move the movement forward.
Likewise. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Big thanks to David Leon for being our guest today. If you liked what he had to say and you want to talk to him about investing in regenerative agriculture, you can contact him directly at david@essopartners.com. And if you're a mission-driven organization that is trying to amplify your impact in the world and needs a little help optimizing the internal function of your organization, you can learn more about us at stillpointinsight.com. Thanks for watching or listening. Thanks for the work that you do, and we'll see you next time on The Turning Point.